Welcome back to Park City Church. My name is Matt. I'm the pastor here. And again, as we've said each week, it's my privilege to be able to connect with you in this way. And we're thankful and glad that you are here with us this morning. We were earlier this week taking our girls back to school to drop off, return items that we'd had from the school year and then pick up things that had been left in the classroom. And we were pulling into the parking lot. It's kind of a long line, and faculty on the sidewalk with masks on. And as we were kind of waiting, the mood in the car was just different, weird. My wife was with us, and the girls in the back. You could just sense that everyone was kind of processing. We had just sort of stepped into quarantine and social distancing and the closing of school, and had just stepped into it and gotten to work. But as we pulled back on campus, the feeling was like, oh no, this is a little bit different. This has been weird. And I was just watching my girls process and verbalize even how they were feeling. Like, will we be back next year? And what will it look like? I mean, literally asking, will our desks be further apart? Those kinds of questions. And I know that for many, the loss of these last few weeks and months has been much more tangible than maybe what my kids were trying to give voice to in the car and what we were feeling. But there is a sense in which, as we pulled in, I was kind of aware, maybe more poignantly or directly, of the loss of connection and of normalcy, of the familiar and of routine that we were all kind of processing in our own way. And out of that feeling, I thought, as I welcome you this morning, that as we prepare to step back into meeting together in person, I am thankful for the privilege that we've had over the last few weeks to stay connected at Park City. I'm thankful and encouraged by our Park City community, and many of you have connected with us over Zoom or connected with us in this way online, that I'm just thankful that we've been able to stay connected, that we have continued to be a community, even though it has changed. And as we step into what will admittedly be a new kind of normal as we reconvene here in a couple of weeks in person, I am thankful that we've been able to connect like this. I was reading this week an article from, I think it was the New Yorker, actually from a couple of months ago at the start of all this. And the title of the article was, I think, called "The Gospel in the Time of Social Distancing." And the author was reflecting on her experience as a kid in a rural church in a farming community, and kind of growing up with that faith, and writing about how churches now are adjusting to what it means to connect and to be together, and all sorts of opinions on what that should look like. But as she's kind of reflecting on the church in this moment, and our community in this moment, she began to think about her experience growing up. And one of her highlights was her dad ringing the church bell each week, his role in that community at the start of service, and then again later on during their time together. And as she grew and began to ask questions about the liturgy and the expression of her church's form of worship, she ended up asking directly, asking her pastor, why do we ring this bell? And he told her in that moment, asked her to think about, could she name the farmers that were a part of their congregation that weren't present in their service? Could she think of who they were, and could she name them? So she began to list off the families and the names of people who weren't present, who couldn't be present because they were out in the field working. And her pastor said to her in that moment, we ring this bell so that wherever people may be, kind of scattered abroad and serving and working just in different places, we ring the bell to remind them that they're still connected, still a part of this community. That every time they hear this bell, they remember that they're a part of something kind of larger than themselves and the work that they're doing, and they're called into or drawn up into our community here. Our praying of the Lord's Prayer together, that they're pulled into this moment. And the author of the article just was reflecting, that over the history of the church and all kinds of ups and downs and periods of disruption, that the church has been ringing bells for a long time, finding ways to stay connected, to be the community, the body of Christ, to be the church together, although it has taken different shapes at different times. And As I think about Park City and our step into maybe what will be new for us now as we come back together, I am thankful and hopeful that hopefully for you, these moments together online or through Zoom and other formats have been a way for us just to ring the bell and remember that you were connected, that we're a part of a community, that this decision to follow Christ is not one you make on your own. And our hope and prayer at Park City is that you have felt connected during this time, but also as we step into what's next. So we're going to be back in the building on June the 7th. Sunday morning, June 7th, that first Sunday in June, we're gonna reconvene as a community together physically, and we're gonna give you a couple of opportunities to join us for worship beginning June 7th. You can find your way here at 9 o'clock or at 10:30. We'll have two services that'll be a chance for you to worship together again for us. And we want to invite you to join us. We'll put out, again, the details of that information. It will look a little bit different, but not unfamiliarly so. And we want to invite you to come and worship with us. So we'll put that information out online and encourage you to come back to our website, and you can find kind of detailed information there. But we're excited to reconvene together and thankful for what we've had, but looking forward to kind of what is in front of us as a community. So before we do, we're going to this week wrap up our series on the new normal as we look at one more conversation that Jesus has, the resurrected Jesus has with Peter. And excited to kind of wrap up this series. And before we step into that passage, I invite you to sing with us.
Who breaks the power of sin and darkness, whose love is mighty and so much stronger, the King of glory, the King above all kings, who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder and leaves us breathless in awe and wonder, the King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross, you would lay down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Oh, the beauty to think of who you are is overwhelming. The promises you make, they will uphold me. How you hold me, your compassions never end. Your mercies are new over and over. Your mercies are new over and over. Surely as the morning comes, you're faithful. I'll sing of your love over and over. I'll sing of your love over and over. always faithful. You never fail me. You're always good. You're always good. And God, you're so good. God, you're so good. And God, you're so good. You're so good to me. Just sing that out one more time. That God, you're so good. God, you're so good. And God, you're so good. You're so good to me.
Our reading this morning comes from John chapter 21, verses 20 through 22. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back against Jesus during the Last Supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" And Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Lord, what about this man? The question at the heart of our passage this morning. Now, as a father of twins, I bump into this question a lot. What about Penny? What about Adelaide? And it comes up in a variety of contexts, positive or negative. We could be fishing for popsicles in the freezer, and one kid is in there digging away. And she says, "Well, what about my sister?" Right? She doesn't want her sister to be left out, to miss out on an opportunity. Or maybe we're clearing the table and we ask one of our children to help, and we go, "Well, what about my sister?" Because, she wants to resist the injustice of having to be the only one to work. And, again, it's a question that just we hear a lot in our home. What about so-and-so? And I think as we step into this question, what about him, at the heart of our reading this morning, that I just want to take a step back and consider the context from which that question flows in this passage. That I think there's a prior question that has led Peter to this moment. It's not explicit in the text, but I do think it's kind of laying there under the surface. That before we get to this question, well, what about the people around me? We hear, I think, under the surface of Peter's life and conversation with Jesus, a slightly different question. A question that maybe I would phrase as, who? Me? Right? That Peter has come out of an intimate conversation with Jesus, where all of his insecurities have kind of risen to the surface. Right? Peter, who, as we know from the story, has denied Jesus, has ridden the ups and downs of the intensity of his life, for good or ill, right? He has sort of ridden the waves of who he is and has brought into this moment, into this conversation with Jesus, a bit of insecurity. Holding on to maybe the things that he feels qualify him for this conversation, but also all too aware of the things that maybe disqualify him from a seat at this table. And then into the midst of all that, Jesus has invited him to breakfast, has said, "Come and eat," and then has told Peter in this moment, "Peter, feed my sheep." Has in a sense addressed this underlying question as Jesus has called Peter forward. Peter in a moment saying, "Me? Really? Lord," Peter says, you know everything. And in spite of all that, Jesus looking at Peter and saying, "Yes, I know everything. You, Peter, follow me." With all the ups and downs of his life, in spite of all of that, Jesus is calling Peter forward, sketching for him in this moment, Jesus has laid out for Peter just a loose sketch of what his life will look like. That Peter's will be a life full of shepherding, of caring for others. Peter's will be a life, Jesus hints, that will be spent in martyrdom. That in pursuit of this calling of shepherding and caring for others, Peter's story will be one of intensity and struggle. And in the midst of all of that, this hopeful pull forwards that, yes, Peter, you belong here, you can hear beneath the surface of Peter's conversation with Jesus. Who, me? I was listening to a podcast this week, he's done some sports writing. His name, I think, is Michael Lewis, and he wrote The Blind Side or Moneyball. And he was talking about his experience as a baseball player, as a kid, being sort of the younger grade and kind of the young edge of the team. And the team was going into an important game, and he's reflecting on the role of coaching. And he describes a moment where their starting pitcher, whom his team had ridden for some time to great success, had to be pulled. And the coach looked at him and gave him the ball and told him, there's nobody else I'd rather have holding the ball in this moment. I'll go out there and pitch. And Michael Lewis describes the honesty of that moment, that it was a bold-faced lie, that clearly he knew and everyone else knew you would rather have the other guy in the game in this moment. In a sense, wrestling with this question, who, me, really, in this moment? But that the coach in that moment breathed new purpose and life and intensity into Michael Lewis's life in a way that altered the trajectory of his life and career. And not to reduce this conversation between Jesus and Peter to pitching in a baseball game, but you get a sense that in this moment, as Jesus speaks to Peter and calls him into what Jesus sees for him, a life of following him, that as Peter wrestles with the insecurity of failure, the insecurity of maybe inexperience or ignorance, of not knowing exactly what's in front of him, that Jesus, in response to all of this insecurity, all this who, me kind of feeling in Peter's heart and mind, you hear the grace of Jesus as he pulls him forward. And I think this is a question, who, me, that if we're honest, is a question that creeps up in all of our lives. Failure, again, insecurity, ignorance, inexperience, all kinds of reasons. It can come from all sorts of places, but that it's a question that is probably familiar to many of us. And I think that it's out of the context of that struggle for Peter that we bump into this next, also very familiar kind of question. What about him? That Peter in this moment, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. Right, as Peter looks around, he sees the disciple whom Jesus loved, which we know to be John, the author of this gospel. He sees him following, and Peter in this moment, wrestling with his own insecurities, says, well, what about him? I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, that maybe this question for Peter is already coming from a place of pastoral care, already shepherding the people around him, right? Well, I don't want him to be left behind. I was reading recently a biography of Churchill about his time as a prisoner of war in the Boer War in South Africa. And he finds himself deep in enemy territory in a POW camp with some other officers of the British Army, one of them a close friend. And his friends, in this case, are plotting an escape. And his friend wants to pull Churchill into this experience, right? Doesn't want to leave him behind, but is reluctant because, unfortunately, Churchill, as we've seen over the course of this biography, has a unique gift for drawing attention to himself and for wanting to be the center of attention. And the author describes the tension of this commanding officer as he wrestles with, well, what about him? His connection to Churchill as a friend, and he wants to take care of him and bring him along, but recognizing the challenges that might present. And I hear in Peter's question here, I want to believe maybe this is his struggle. Right? I don't want to leave John behind, right? What about him? And again, maybe we ask the question in the same way, maybe, on occasion. But I think that more likely than not, that this question is really maybe just a subtle slide towards something a little less noble. That I think probably far more often, that what on the surface appears to be a question that comes out of a concern for others often is really just a veiled way of asking a much more pernicious question. What about me? What about me? That this question for Peter seems to be a question that's motivated by a concern for the people around him. I wonder if really it just betrays a still nagging concern for himself. And I think this is true even for you and me, that oftentimes this question, as we look around at the people around us and get caught up in games of comparison and wondering that what on the surface can appear to be a concern for others is all too often a concern for ourselves. I mean, for Peter, Jesus has just painted a picture of martyrdom, of struggle, of intensity. That for Peter, following Jesus will not be easy. And so in response to that, Peter, well, what about this guy? Is it going to be this hard for him? I think here, even in this moment, before cell phones, maybe we're bumping into this slightly more sinister effects of social media, that here Peter is caught up in the game of understanding who he is in relation to the people around him. That by virtue maybe of comparing his story to the story of this other disciple, trying to make sense of who he is again in relation to the stories of the people around him. Jesus in this moment, as we'll see, pushing against that tendency in all of our hearts. Martin Luther of the Protestant Reformation, drawing on the work of St. Augustine much earlier in church history, describes sin, this brokenness in our relationship with others, but ultimately in our relationship with God, describes sin as an inward curve, a curve in upon ourselves. And I wonder if running through the heart of this question for Peter isn't a bit of that inward curve. That growing out of, as I've heard put this week, the insecurity of our subterranean selves is this concern that motivates Peter's question, well, what about him? And that really wrapped up in that is a concern for Peter. Man, my story sounds a little challenging or difficult or hard, or I'm trying to make sense of this. And in comparison to the stories of the people around me, we get lost in these questions and these insecurities. All of them, I think, subtle reflections of the inward curve and fears towards ourselves. And it's into the midst of all of these questions that Jesus kind of interrupts this conversation with a question of his own. And he says to Peter, what is that to you? It's abrupt and challenging, as often Jesus is prone to do, but it's also full of grace. That with this question, Jesus kind of opens up a new way forward for Peter and for you and me. Jesus says, what is that to you? You follow me. You follow me. And that this call to follow is not a kind of, all right, Peter, you set off, go make it happen. Rather, it's an invitation to walk with Jesus, to know, Peter, that as you follow this journey, to know you as you listen and hear the good news of Christ, that you don't walk alone. That the promise of Jesus to Peter in this moment, to you, to me, to John, the other disciple, is that in the midst of whatever story he's inviting you to live, as you follow him, you know that he walks with you. In fact, Jesus has spent all of the preceding chapters towards the close of this gospel, of John's gospel. Jesus has gone to great lengths to remind his disciples that normal for you is going to change. That my physical presence with you will be different. I won't be accompanying you in the same way that I have in the past, he says. But he's been very careful to make sure they know that still he will be with them. That he will give them the Holy Spirit. That his Spirit will be with them, whatever the trajectory of their lives, guiding them and instructing them and advocating for them and comforting them. That he will be with them. And so he says to Peter, what is that to you? You, Peter, follow me. Walk with me. I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we've been reading the Chronicles of Narnia with our girls during quarantine. And we kind of started by accident and just decided to keep going. And last week we finished The Horse and His Boy. And it's a story, not surprisingly, about a horse and his boy. and a couple of other main characters as Aslan the lion leads them along, often without their knowledge, and helping them along the way on this quest, this adventure. And along the way, they find themselves separated from one another, their stories taking, again, slightly different trajectories. But towards the end, as they find themselves together again, we read the little boy, the boy asking of Aslan, well, what about her? This question, again, that Peter helps us step into. What about her? And in response to that question, Aslan says to the boy, "Child, I am telling you your story, not hers. No one is told any story but their own." I think we live in a world obsessed with stories, crafting them and filtering them and photoshopping them, that we live in a world we're just saturated with the stories of others, literally following them. And in the midst of all of that, it's easy to get lost. It is, I think, easy to read all of these stories and to take them all in for what they can make us feel about ourselves. Rightly or wrongly, for good or ill, that as we take in all of these stories, we find ourselves wrestling with a question that I think is at the heart, again, of Peter's question. Well, what about me? Trying to define and understand who we are in relation to the stories of others. And into the midst of all of that dizziness, into that kind of inward curve and turn upon ourselves, Jesus speaks a word of grace, of invitation. You, he says, follow me. And Jesus doesn't leave us to fill out what that invitation means. He doesn't leave us to define what that is. He spent the whole gospel of John's gospel giving shape to that calling. That to follow him is to follow in his way, is to trust him as the bread of life, as the living water, as the good shepherd who leads and guides, as the way, the truth, and the life, is to trust Jesus as the resurrection and the life. But that as we step into that life of following, sure, the particulars of our stories may be different, but the gracious invitation of Jesus is the same. Follow me. And as you go this week, my hope and prayer is that you would hear the gracious call of Christ to follow him, and to know that wrapped up in that invitation to you is the promise that he is with you. So that as you go into whatever new normals might look like for you, with all of your own questions, whatever they may be, who, me, or what about him, or what about me? That as you bring all of those questions into this life of following Jesus, that you would know, as Paul tells us in Ephesians, that you would know what is the hope of this calling. And what is the incomparable greatness of his power towards you as you believe and trust him. The power, the same power that raised Christ from the dead. Go in peace, Park City Church.